Every winter on the frontier, somebody swore they heard wolves outside the cabin. Whole territories paid cash bounties on them. Newspapers printed the stories all season long. Mothers used them to keep children out of the timber after dark. And in all the years men were pushing west across the plains and up into the mountains, wolves killed almost none of them. Something else was doing the killing. It came in a bottle. It was sold at every trading post, every Army sutler's store, every riverboat landing from St. Louis to Fort Benton. And nearly every trapper, freighter, and homesteader carried it into the cold on purpose, because he believed it would keep him warm. It did the exact opposite. This is the winter myth that emptied more cabins than any wolf pack ever did. Start with the wolves, because the frontier was genuinely obsessed with them. By the middle of the 1800s, killing wolves was a paying job across the western territories. Counties posted bounties. A man could carry in a pair of ears and walk back out with hard money in his pocket. Cattlemen laced dead cows with strychnine and left them out on the open range through the winter, and the poison killed everything that came to feed: the wolves, the coyotes, the foxes, the eagles, and quite often the ranch dogs, too. By 1926, there was not a single wolf left in Yellowstone. Think about what that actually means. The federal government trapped, shot, and poisoned an animal into local extinction inside a national park, a place created specifically to protect the wildlife in it. That is not the behavior of men worried about a few missing calves. That is fear, written into law, and the fear got fed constantly. Winter newspapers ran wolf stories the way summer newspapers ran drowning stories. A sleigh chased across the river ice by a pack. A schoolteacher treed until dawn. A trapper found on his own line with an empty rifle and nothing left of him but a pair of boots. Those stories traveled from paper to paper for years, picking up new detail every time an editor reprinted them, growing an extra wolf here, a longer chase there. Go looking for the bodies, though, and the record gets very thin very fast. In North America, a healthy wild wolf killing a grown human being is one of the rarest events in the recorded history of this continent. Across the entire 20th century, in the lower 48 states, there is not one confirmed fatal wolf attack on a person, not a single one. The two modern deaths anybody can actually point to both happened in the far north, and both happened in living memory. A young geology student named Kenton Carnegie died in northern Saskatchewan in 2005, and researchers still argue over whether it was wolves or a black bear. A schoolteacher named Candace Berner was killed while out running near a village in western Alaska in 2010. 2 names. That is the entire modern list for a continent. Now hold that up against what the same winters were doing to the same country. Because while men were nailing wolf hides to barn doors, the cold was killing their neighbors by the hundreds, and nobody ever put a bounty on it. The frontier killed people in ways that never made a good newspaper illustration. A freighter caught between towns with a load of flour and no timber for a fire. A line rider sent out to check fence in weather that turned on him. A mail carrier on a route that looked simple in October and was a death sentence in February. A homesteader who walked out to the barn to feed stock lost the house in a whiteout and was found in the spring less than 100 paces from his own door. That last one happened so often that families across the northern plains ran a rope from the kitchen door to the barn door every autumn and left it up until the thaw. Not because they were nervous, because they had all heard the same story about somebody in the next county who had not bothered. The single ugliest day of it came on the 12th of January, 1888. The morning was strangely mild across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and Kansas. Warm enough that children walked to their one-room schoolhouses in light coats, some of them with no coats at all. Farmers took the chance to work outside without gloves. Then, in the early afternoon, a front came down out of the northwest, so fast that people described it as a wall. The temperature fell through the floor. The snow that came with it was not soft flakes, it was frozen dust, fine as ground glass, driven sideways hard enough that a man could not open his eyes into it. Teachers had a decision to make, and no good way to make it. Some kept the children inside and burned the desks, the coal box, and anything else in the room. Those children mostly lived. Others sent them home to families who were only half a mile away and lost them somewhere in between. Something like 235 people died in that one storm. It is remembered as the Schoolhouse Blizzard, or by the name that stuck harder, the Children's Blizzard. And that was one afternoon. Some winters simply refused to end. Dakota Territory went into October of 1880 and did not come back out until the following May. Blizzards arrived one after another with barely a clear week between them, and the snow packed into the railroad cuts so hard that crews shoveling by hand could not keep the line open. Trains stopped entirely. Whole towns ran out of coal, then out of flour, then out of everything, and spent months burning twisted hay and grinding seed wheat in coffee mills to stay alive. A girl named Laura Ingalls lived through that winter in a frozen store building in De Smet, and she wrote it down decades later, which is the only reason most people have ever heard of it at all. Then there was the winter that broke the open range. The autumn of 1886 came in after a brutal, dry summer, with the grass already grazed down to dirt, and cattle went into the cold season thin. What followed on the northern plains was months of storm and deep-crusted snow, with cattle drifting for miles until they piled up dead against drift fences. Ranchers came out in the spring to find outfits that had been worth a fortune reduced to bones in the coulees. They called it the Great Die-Up, and it ended the era of the free-roaming cattle empire in a single season. Cows were not the only things dying out there. Cowboys were sent into that weather to push stock toward shelter, and some of them did not come back either. Their names are in county records and nowhere else. Nobody blamed a wolf for a single one of those deaths. But there is a second storm story running underneath this whole chapter of history, and it did not need a blizzard to work. It killed on ordinary cold nights, in ordinary weather, one man at a time, and it was carried into the cold voluntarily. Whiskey was not a vice on the frontier. It was equipment. It went west in barrels on keelboats up the Missouri. It was the main currency at the summer rendezvous in the Rockies, where a season of beaver plews could be drunk down in about a week. Traders cut it with river water, tobacco, molasses, and peppers until the barrel went 4 times as far and sold it anyway. Congress banned alcohol in Indian country in 1832, and the big fur companies simply kept moving it because it was the single most profitable thing in the entire trade. And running alongside all that commerce was a belief that everybody held, from the illiterate trapper to the trained physician in Boston. Whiskey warms a man up. You can find it in medical writing of the period. Doctors prescribed spirits for exposure. Ships carried a rum ration for men working the winter rigging. Army posts issued whiskey to soldiers on cold duty. British and American expeditions dragged casks of it across the Arctic on sledges, using up hauling weight that could have carried food. Grandmothers made a hot toddy for anybody who came in from the barn shivering, and everybody in the kitchen watched that person go pink and comfortable within about 2 minutes, which is exactly the problem. The myth was not stupid. The myth was convincing, because it delivered something you could feel immediately. Take a swallow of strong liquor in a cold room, and something real happens inside your body within a minute or two. Alcohol relaxes the muscle walls of your blood vessels, the ones closest to the surface, in your face, your neck, your hands. Open up wider than they were. Warm blood from deep inside your body comes rushing out into the skin. That is the flush. That is the red face, the warm fingers, the loose, comfortable feeling in the shoulders. And here is the trick your body plays on you. Your temperature sensors are in your skin. They are not in your heart. They are not in your liver. So when hot blood floods the surface, the sensors report exactly what they are feeling, which is warmth, and your brain accepts it without argument. You feel warm because a part of you genuinely is warm. Now put that man outside at 12 below zero with a north wind coming across open ground. All that warm blood he just pushed to the surface is sitting right up against the coldest air in the county, separated from it by a wool coat and a couple of layers of skin. Wind strips heat off it as fast as his heart can deliver it. What he has actually done is open every window in the house and turn the furnace up, and then congratulate himself on how nice it feels near the window. Sober, his body was defending him. In cold, healthy circulation, clamps down hard on the extremities on purpose. Hands and feet go pale and numb because your body has decided it would rather lose fingers than lose your heart. It is a brutal piece of triage, and it works. Whiskey overrides it. Whiskey takes the one defense that keeps your core alive and switches it off, and it charges the man a fee of pure comfort for doing it. To understand why one bad idea could kill so efficiently, it helps to know the 4 doors that heat leaves a body through. The frontier had no names for any of them. It just knew, by hard experience, which mistakes buried people. The first door is contact. Heat pours out of you into anything solid and cold that you are touching, sitting on a rock, lying down on frozen ground, kneeling in wet snow to work on a broken axle. A man who lies directly on the ground with 3 good blankets over him is far worse off than a man with 2 blankets under him and 1 on top, and every experienced trapper on the continent knew to get spruce boughs, grass, hides, saddle blankets, anything at all between his body and the earth. The second door is moving air. Still air right against your skin gets warmed by you and then works as insulation. Wind tears that layer away and replaces it with fresh cold air over and over, hundreds of times a minute. This is why an open flat at 10 below with a hard wind will kill a man faster than 30 below in dead calm timber. It is also why survivors on the plains crawled under wagon boxes, into cut banks, behind dead horses, into anything at all that stopped the wind. The third door is radiation, and it is the reason so many bodies were found without a hat. An uncovered head, face, and neck bleed heat straight out into the sky, and a clear night sky is one of the coldest things you will ever stand under. The fourth door is evaporation, and it is the sneakiest one. Every bit of moisture that leaves your body takes heat with it, breath, sweat, and most of all, wet clothing. A man who chopped wood or broke trail hard enough to soak his shirt and then stopped moving was in real trouble within minutes, because that soaked shirt was now a machine for pulling heat out of him. Old hands out west manage their own sweat like a resource. Loosen your coat before you start working. Slow down before you soak through. Being cold and dry beats being warm and wet every single time. Now put a bottle into that system. Alcohol jams the first line of defense wide open, floods the skin with hot blood, and then hands that heat to all 4 doors at once. Losing core heat faster is only the first thing alcohol does to a man in the cold. There are 3 more, and each one is worse than the last. The first is shivering. Shivering looks pathetic and feels humiliating, but it is one of the most impressive things the human body does. Uncontrolled muscle contraction can raise your heat production several times above resting level. A shivering man is running his own furnace. Alcohol blunts that response and delays it. The furnace comes on late and it runs weaker. The second is fuel. Shivering burns sugar at an enormous rate, and your liver is supposed to keep releasing more into your blood to feed it. Alcohol interferes with that job while the liver is busy dealing with the alcohol itself. So the man in the snow has a furnace that will not light properly and a fuel line that is being pinched at the same time. The third one is the killer, and it is the reason the myth was so lethal specifically on the frontier. Alcohol takes away judgment at exactly the moment judgment is the only thing that can save you. Cold does this on its own, which is the cruelty of hypothermia. As the core drops, a person gets clumsy first. Fingers stop obeying, so buckles, buttons, matches, and rifle actions all become impossible. Then speech goes thick. Then comes the confusion, and it does not feel like confusion from the inside. It feels like clarity. Men in that state make firm, confident decisions that are completely insane. They leave the wagon. They abandon a shelter they spent an hour building. They put the axe down in the snow and walk away from it. They decide, with total certainty, to lie down. Now start that man half drunk, and every stage arrives sooner and hits harder. There is a final stage that used to make coroners in cold country suspect murder, and it is one of the strangest things in medicine. It is called paradoxical undressing. Late in severe hypothermia, the vessels that had clamped shut suddenly relax all at once, and a wave of blood dumps into the skin. The dying person is hit with a sensation of intense, overwhelming heat, and does the only thing that makes sense to him. He tears his clothes off. That is why men were found in the snow with a good coat lying 20 feet behind them and boots off in the drift. Not robbed, not attacked, just fooled one last time by the exact same sensation the bottle had been selling them all night. Some go one step further into something called terminal burrowing, crawling into a crevice, under a log, beneath a wagon box, into any small dark space. Searchers in the spring would find a man wedged somewhere that made no sense at all, and they would tell each other something must have been chasing him. And so the wolves got the credit again. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the parts that got left out of the school books, go ahead and subscribe. New stories from the frontier every week. Now, let me show you where the myth came from in the first place, because one piece of it was invented by a painter who had never been up a mountain in his life. Picture a rescue dog in the snow. Almost everybody pictures the same animal. A big St. Bernard, chest deep in a drift somewhere high in the Alps, with a small wooden keg of brandy strapped under its chin, coming to save a freezing traveler. The monks of the great St. Bernard Hospice really did breed and train those dogs, and the dogs really did save lives in that pass for well over a century. The most famous of them, an animal called Barry, is credited with dozens of rescues in the early 1800s, and you can still go and see him, preserved, in a museum in Bern. The barrel never happened. The dogs of the hospice did not carry brandy or wine or anything else to drink. The monks have said so plainly for generations. That keg comes from a painting. In 1820, a teenage English artist named Edwin Landseer painted a scene of two of these dogs standing over a traveler, collapsed in the snow, and for the sake of the composition, he hung a small cask around one dog's neck. The painting was enormously popular. It was engraved, copied, printed, hung in parlors, put on tins and calendars and greeting cards, and within a generation the barrel was simply a fact that everyone knew. A young man's artistic flourish became a piece of global common sense, and it taught the whole English-speaking world one specific lesson without ever saying it out loud. When a person is dying of cold, the thing you bring them is liquor. It is a beautiful image. It has probably contributed to more cold weather deaths than any other picture ever painted. The whiskey myth did not travel alone. It came bundled with a whole set of winter rules that everybody on the frontier believed, and that ranged from useless to actively fatal. Rub snow on frostbite. This one was everywhere, and it survived well into the 20th century. The reasoning sounded sensible. Warm the flesh gradually instead of shocking it. What is actually happening in frostbitten tissue is that ice crystals have formed inside and between the cells, and that tissue has the structural integrity of wet paper. Grinding snow into it does not warm anything, it shreds it. Men lost fingers, ears, and whole feet to the treatment rather than to the injury. Thaw it out by the fire right now. Also common, also terrible, rapid, uncontrolled heat on frozen tissue causes enormous damage. And worse, if that hand is going to freeze again in the next few hours, thawing it first is far more destructive than leaving it frozen until you reach real shelter. Keep him walking. Do not let him sleep. Half right, which is the most dangerous kind of wrong. In the early stages, movement helps, but in deep hypothermia, forcing a stumbling man to keep marching pumps cold blood from his limbs back into his core and can stop his heart outright. Rescuers today handle a severely hypothermic person the way you would handle a full cup of coffee, deliberately and gently. Wet clothes are better than no clothes, a frontier standby and completely backward. Wet fabric strips heat out of a body many times faster than dry air does. The men who came through worst weather alive were fanatical about staying dry, to the point of stopping and rebuilding a fire in the middle of a march to dry a pair of socks. And underneath all of it sat the same instruction, the one nobody questioned. If it gets bad, take a drink. Here's the part that proves this was never really about how harsh the country was, because plenty of people worked those same winters, in worse conditions, and came home every time. Look at the Arctic, where the contrast is almost too clean to be true. Sir John Franklin sailed in 1845 with 2 Royal Navy ships, 129 men, engraved silver cutlery, a library of over 1,000 books, and an enormous quantity of liquor. Every man aboard was lost. Not one came back. Around the same stretch of coast, a Scottish surveyor named John Ray traveled the same Arctic with tiny parties, sometimes only a handful of men. He learned from the Inuit, and then actually did what they did. He built snow houses instead of hauling tents. He wore fur clothing cut loose so sweat could escape instead of soaking into wool. He hunted as he went instead of dragging tinned food across the ice. He kept his men moving on their own feet, rather than harnessed like animals to a sledge. Ray mapped thousands of miles of that coastline, found the first hard evidence of what happened to Franklin's expedition, and brought his people home. The difference was not toughness. Franklin's men were tough. The difference was that one group treated the North as an enemy to be outsupplied, and the other group asked the people who had lived there for thousands of years how it was actually done. The same lesson had already been taught to an American expedition 40 years earlier on the upper Missouri, and it is worth stopping on because the evidence is written down day by day. In the winter of 1804 into 1805, Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery holed up beside the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in what is now North Dakota. They built themselves a triangular log fort with a stockade, and by the standards of the United States Army at the time, it was a solid piece of work. Then the cold came, and it came like nothing any of those men from Virginia and Kentucky had imagined. The journal's record readings around 40 below. Sentries had to be relieved constantly. Men who went out hunting came back with frostbitten feet and frozen fingers, and the captain spent a good part of that winter treating them. A short walk away in the Mandan villages, several thousand people were having a perfectly ordinary winter. They lived in round earth lodges, timber frames packed over with willow, grass, and a thick skin of soil, dug down slightly into the ground. The earth itself did the insulating, the same way a root cellar never freezes. A central fire and a smoke hole handled the rest. Inside, families kept horses out of the weather, stored corn and squash and beans in deep cache pits, and went about their business while the men in the log fort a few hundred yards away froze at their posts. The Corps had better rifles, better tools, and the backing of a national government. The Mandan had a better roof. In that country, in that season, the roof mattered more. The same split shows up across the American frontier. The trappers who survived decade after decade in the mountains had picked up their winter methods from native people, and those methods look almost boring next to the folklore. They ate fat, deliberately and constantly, not lean meat, fat. Pemmican was dried meat pounded to powder and mixed with rendered tallow until it was more than half fat by weight. Men who ate nothing but lean game in winter got sick and weak no matter how much of it they ate, something they called rabbit starvation, and the fix was always grease. They wore loose layers, not tight ones, because tight clothing crushes the trapped air that is doing the actual insulating and cuts off circulation to the feet. They wore soft moccasins packed with dry grass instead of stiff boots. They stuffed their gear with more grass and changed it when it got damp. They built small fires and sat close rather than big fires that scorch your front while your back freezes. They dug in. They got behind something, a cut bank, a deadfall, a snow wall, anything that broke the wind, because wind is what turns cold into a killer. And the ones who lasted longest had a rule about the bottle that they held to like Scripture. Drink in camp when the work is done and the fire is banked and you are not going anywhere, never on the trail, never before a river crossing, never when the weather is turning. They did not know about blood vessel dilation. They had no words for core temperature. They simply had a very long memory for which men came back in the spring and which men did not. What makes this worth telling now is that the belief never actually died. It just changed outfits. It is the flask passed around on the chairlift. It is the shot somebody hands you at a tailgate in November. It is the nightcap that helps a person sleep in a house where the furnace has quit, and the drinks on the walk home from a bar in a northern city in January. When modern coroners investigate deaths from exposure, alcohol turns up again and again in the toxicology, in city and country alike. The classic case is not a mountaineer or an explorer. It is a person who was somewhere ordinary, drank, felt fine, and made one confident decision on the way home. Take the shortcut. Sit down for a minute. Rest their eyes. Same flush. Same false comfort. Same ending as a freight driver on the Dakota Plains 140 years ago. The frontier feared the wrong animal. Men shot wolves, poisoned them, wiped them off entire mountain ranges, and paid money for their ears. And the whole time, the thing actually taking their friends was sitting in the corner of the trading post in a barrel, respectable, legal, recommended by physicians, and warm going down. The wolf was never really the enemy out there. The enemy was a piece of advice that felt true in your hands and your face while it quietly took your heart apart. And it worked so well precisely because it was so pleasant. Every generation has one of these. Something everybody knows, everybody repeats, nobody tests, and a few people die from every winter. So tell me in the comments, what is the one piece of old advice you grew up hearing that turned out to be completely wrong? Some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment down there. If you made it this far, subscribe, because next week we are opening the cellar door and going through the ways these same families kept a full year of food with no refrigerator anywhere on the property.